Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Today, I'd like to discuss how the Harry Potter films tried to portray Severus Snape in a more positive light by altering many moments from the books. Enjoy the video. Number 1. Snape in the films, softer and kinder. In the films, Snape appears much softer towards the students, especially those who are not in Slytherin. He might make sarcastic remarks and punish Harry and his friends, but overall, his cruelty is significantly toned down. In the books, however, Snape was far more brutal, often mocking Harry, Ron, and Hermione for their appearance and intellectual abilities. He frequently humiliated Neville, pushing him to the brink of panic, and even tried to have Remus Lupin fired despite him being a good teacher. Number 2. Snape and the werewolf scene. In the films, Snape protects Harry and his friends during Lupin's transformation into a werewolf, presenting himself as a hero ready to defend the students. However, in the book, the situation was quite different. Snape did not show such heroism and was more concerned about finding Sirius than ensuring the students' safety. This change drastically alters the perception of Snape, turning him into a more noble character in the eyes of the audience. Number 3. The rivalry with James Potter. In the films, it's shown that James Potter deeply hurt Snape, which becomes a key element in his tragic backstory. However, the details of their rivalry were greatly simplified. In the books, their enmity was much more complex, and in reality, James and Snape often attacked each other without provocation. James hated Snape for his interest in the dark arts, but Potter himself wasn't without faults, such as when he saved Snape's life during one of their incidents. Number 4. Snape and Lily twisting the relationship. In the films, the scene with James and Lily in the hallway is portrayed in a way that shows Lily displaying sympathy towards James, which in theory distances her from Snape. In the books, however, Lily supported Snape until he called her a mudblood. Later, she turned away from him upon learning about his association with Voldemort. This twist was omitted from the film, presenting Snape as a victim that the viewer should feel sorry for. Number 5. Snape and Voldemort, hidden details. The films did not give enough attention to Snape's role within the Death Eaters. In the books, his involvement in the Potters' betrayal was fully revealed. He overheard the prophecy about Harry and informed Voldemort, after which he asked the Dark Lord to spare Lily Potter's life. This crucial detail, which sheds light on Snape's motives, was removed from the films to present him as a more noble character. Number 6. The omitted scene with Pettigrew. In Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, one particularly disturbing moment is Snape's treatment of Peter Pettigrew while he is hiding at the Malfoy Manor. Snape, despite his role as a double agent, shows no mercy for Pettigrew. In a chilling scene, Snape orders Peter to serve him wine like a servant. "Pour it, Pettigrew," Snape commands, his voice cold and commanding. This scene highlights Snape's cruel nature, revealing that despite any superficial gestures of redemption, he takes pleasure in degrading those weaker than him. Pettigrew, who betrayed his friends and became a cowardly sycophant, is at Snape's mercy. Snape's treatment of him, however, is not just a product of duty. It's a clear display of his need to exert control over the vulnerable, a way to feed his own sense of superiority. The films, however, leave out this significant moment. Snape's treatment of Pettigrew is barely mentioned, and certainly not shown in any real detail. The audience misses the darker side of Snape's character. the sadistic pleasure he takes in belittling others. This omission further blurs the lines between Snape as a hero and a villain. Without these moments of cruelty, the films present Snape as a more straightforward, less morally complicated character. His interactions with other Death Eaters are sanitized, and his actions become more about his role as a protector of Harry rather than a deeply flawed and contradictory individual. The films, by glossing over these dark moments, reduce Snape, his complexity, and make him seem less like an anti-hero and more like a misunderstood figure. Number 7, his attitude toward Harry until the very end. The final moments of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows are meant to be a poignant revelation. Harry stands over Snape, his lifeless body, tears streaming down his face as he learns the truth about the sacrifices Snape made for him. In a moment of emotional clarity, he names his son after Snape, a symbol of the forgiveness he now feels. It's a heart-wrenching, beautiful conclusion to a complex relationship. However, in the books, Snape's attitude toward Harry didn't shift even in his final moments. Throughout their time at Hogwarts, Snape consistently despised Harry, constantly belittling him and never missing an opportunity to undermine him. Even after all he'd done for Harry's safety, Snape remained cold and resentful, driven by his hatred for Harry's father, James. "You have your mother's eyes," Snape tells Harry, but the bitterness in his voice speaks volumes about his unresolved animosity. The films, however, present a different narrative, one of a noble, tragic hero. They push the idea of Snape as a martyr driven by an undying love for Lily Potter, selflessly protecting Harry out of guilt and regret. The films romanticize Snape's actions, painting him as a misunderstood savior, a victim of his circumstances. But in the books, Snape's motivations are far more complicated and far from saintly. His decision to protect Harry was rooted in a promise made to Dumbledore, not an act of newfound love or forgiveness. Snape never truly loved Harry. He fulfilled his duty because of his guilt over Lily's death. This internal conflict, his bitterness, and his inability to overcome his hatred of James Potter makes Snape's character far more morally ambiguous. The films gloss over these complexities, offering a more simplistic and heroic portrayal that strips away the darker, more human elements of Snape's journey. Number 8, the excluded scene with Ginny. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, one of the most unsettling moments comes when Snape humiliates Ginny Weasley during a potion lesson. After she is injured by a cauldron, Snape doesn't offer help or concern. Instead, he seizes the opportunity to belittle her in front of the entire class. "You should have known better than to make such a mistake, Weasley," he sneers, his voice dripping with disdain. The cruelty of his words isn't just about the injury, it's about Snape's utter lack of empathy and his need to assert his superiority over students who are not from Slytherin. Ginny, vulnerable and embarrassed, is left to endure this public shaming, while Snape stands unaffected, enjoying his control over her humiliation. This scene, however, was completely omitted from the films. In fact, Snape barely interacts with Ginny at all in the movies. His prejudice and cruelty toward her, and by extension to the non-Slytherin students, are never made clear to the audience. Ginny's mistreatment is left unaddressed, and viewers are deprived of a crucial insight into Snape's character. The films avoid showing how deeply ingrained his bias is, choosing to downplay the complexity of his behavior. Instead of presenting Snape as a teacher who actively targets students based on their house. They reduce him to a figure who merely maintains an aloof, distant professionalism. This omission serves to soften Snape as character in the films, making him appear more like a strict, though somewhat benign, teacher. By removing this scene, the filmmakers avoid highlighting Snape, his ongoing emotional cruelty, especially towards students he holds in contempt. This choice prevents the audience from fully understanding the extent of his prejudices and the darker aspects of his character. The films prioritize making Snape more sympathetic and less antagonistic, thus removing one of the key moments that reveal the true depth of his cruelty. Number 9. A shadow over Hermione. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Snape's cruelty toward Hermione is evident when he catches her and Harry sneaking out of the Gryffindor dormitory late at night. Without hesitation, he strips 50 points from their house. "You'll be lucky if I don't take more," he sneers. This act is not just punishment, it's a calculated move to humiliate them and undermine their chances in the House Cup. Snape doesn't just want to enforce the rules, he wants to make an example of them. He wants to remind Harry and his friends that they are inferior and that no act of defiance will go unpunished. This moment reveals his obsessive desire to break their spirits, to remind them of their place. In the books, Snape also humiliates Hermione more subtly, mocking her appearance. He makes a cruel remark about her teeth, a line that cuts deeper than any of his other insults. "I see you've finally found your teeth, Miss Granger," he mocks. The cruelty of this comment is not just about the insult, it's about Snape's need to diminish Hermione in front of everyone, to make her feel self-conscious and small. He takes pleasure in using her insecurities against her, and his comments sting, not just because of the words themselves, but because they strike at the heart of Hermione's vulnerabilities. In the books, this ongoing emotional abuse serves to highlight Snape's sadistic tendencies. In the films, however, these moments are softened or entirely omitted. Snape's treatment of Hermione is reduced to passing sarcastic comments, and his bullying tendencies are downplayed. The film version of Snape is more of a straight-laced authority figure, less prone to vicious personal attacks. The insults about Hermione's appearance are left out, and his sarcastic remarks are framed as dry humor rather than cruelty. By toning down his behavior, the films strip away the depth of Snape's malice, turning him into a character who's sharp but not truly harmful. This decision highlights how the films sought to avoid depicting Snape as overtly cruel, instead making his actions appear more like clever wit than outright bullying. Number 10. The simplified conflict with Sirius. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, the tension between Sirius Black and Severus Snape runs deep, rooted in years of animosity. Their mutual hatred is more than just petty rivalry, it's a clash of two men who have never forgiven each other for the past. Snape despises Sirius for his role in tormenting him at school, and Sirius, for his part, loathes Snape's allegiance to the dark arts. The weight of this conflict is shown when Snape informs Dumbledore that Sirius has escaped from Grimmauld Place. "You really don't care what happens to him, do you?" Harry accuses Snape, and Snape's cold response reveals just how far his hatred goes. "I don't care what happens to him." This venomous disdain is part of the deep, unresolved history between them, and it permeates their every interaction. In the films, however, this conflict is brushed over, reduced to a few snide comments and brief exchanges. The emotional weight of the animosity is completely lost. The The films show Snape and Sirius exchanging barbed words, but the lingering bitterness, the decades of hatred, and the unresolved issues that drive their actions are barely touched upon. One of the key moments when Snape almost reveals the truth about Sirius's role in the betrayal of the Potters is barely explored. The films gloss over how personal and deep their conflict really is, instead portraying it as a mere rivalry between two characters with little to no backstory or context. The simplification of this rivalry changes the nature of their interactions. In the books, it's clear that Snape's obsession with revenge against Sirius is something that defines him. He's not just a teacher who dislikes a former schoolmate, he's a man who is consumed by the past and driven by the desire for retribution. His hatred is toxic and all-encompassing. The films, by stripping away these complexities, reduce Snape to a victim of circumstance. They present him as a man who is misunderstood but not truly angry or vengeful. In doing so, they remove a crucial aspect of Snape's character, the depth of his bitterness and the unresolved trauma that shapes much of his actions throughout the series. Number 11. Disregard for children in distress. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Snape's indifference to the suffering of his students is glaringly evident. When Marcus Belby, a student in his class, arrives with a bruise under his eye, Snape's response is chillingly detached. "Next time, try dodging," he says, barely glancing at the boy. The casual cruelty of Snape's words sends a clear message. He doesn't care about the safety or well-being of his students, especially if they aren't from Slytherin. To him, their pain is insignificant. He doesn't inquire about what happened, doesn't try to comfort or protect Marcus. Instead, he dismisses the injury as though it's just another minor inconvenience. This moment, though brief, highlights the coldness Snape shows towards anyone who doesn't fall under his personal favor. In the films, however, this indifference is completely absent. Snape is portrayed as a strict but professional teacher, one who enforces discipline in his classroom with a somewhat stern, yet seemingly caring demeanor. His interactions with the students are shown with a more neutral tone. The moments where Snape's disregard for the safety of his students could have been highlighted are entirely ignored. Instead of showing Snape as emotionally detached and uncaring, the films focus on his role as a teacher whose primary concern is maintaining order, even if that order comes at the expense of compassion. This shift in portrayal takes away from the darker, more morally ambiguous aspects of Snape's character. This omission in the films downplays the ethical conflict at the heart of Snape's character. In the books, Snape's actions reveal a teacher who, while capable of protecting his own, lacks any real concern for the well-being of others. His behavior towards students like Marcus Belby suggests that he sees their suffering as an inconvenience, not a tragedy. The films, by sanitizing his actions, transform Snape from a morally complex figure filled with both cruelty and occasional care into a more straightforward and less conflicted character. The films miss the opportunity to show how Snape's apathy towards his students' distress is a critical part of his personality, one that reveals much about his true nature. Number 12. Snape and Harry during occlumency. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Harry's lessons in occlumency under Snape's supervision quickly descend into a nightmare. Snape, cold and merciless, offers no guidance on the theory behind the magic. Instead, he mocks Harry as every mistake is biting sarcasm, stinging with every failure. "You are a disgrace," Snape tells him after one failed attempt. He doesn't explain what Harry is doing wrong or offer any constructive feedback. Instead, he makes the boy feel utterly worthless, saying, "You will not succeed, Potter. You are too weak." It's not just the harshness of his words, but the complete disregard for Harry's well-being that creates a suffocating atmosphere of psychological torment. In the book Snape as Intrusion into Harry, Memories adds another layer of discomfort. He doesn't just teach, he invades. During one particularly intense session, Snape forces Harry to relive a painful memory, violating the boundaries between teacher and student. "Legilimens!" he commands, pulling Harry into his own mind without warning. The personal memories Harry holds dear, including those of his parents, are laid bare, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. This invasion goes far beyond magic. It is a violation of trust and privacy. Harry is helpless, unable to stop the flow of memories, and Snape uses this power ruthlessly. The films, however, transform these moments into a spectacle of magic and action, stripping away the dark undertones. In the film adaptation of Order of the Phoenix, the occlumency lessons are reduced to a series of brief, visually stunning scenes. Instead of the biting words and emotional cruelty, we see flashes of magical duels, Snape and Harry battling through their wands. The uncomfortable tension that builds in the books is nowhere to be found in the film. The lessons aren't a psychological battle. They are just a clash of lights and shadows, a magical duel that ends with little emotional impact. The films ignore the true essence of Snape's behavior, the manipulation and control he exerts over Harry, all while masking it under the guise of training. In the book, Snape's actions aren't just about teaching, they are about asserting dominance, breaking Harry's spirit. In the film, these lessons turn into a visually appealing but emotionally hollow sequence. The real psychological torture, the feeling of helplessness and humiliation is lost. Snape's cruel approach in the book is what shapes Harry's experience, but in the films, that depth is watered down to a mere magical confrontation. Number 13, redemption out of love or for himself. Severus. Snape's character in the Harry Potter series has always been one of the most complex and enigmatic. The films, while rich in visuals and emotions, have sometimes been criticized for simplifying the depth of his motivations. One of the most crucial aspects of Snape's character, his deep and often painful love for Lily Potter, has been treated with much more complexity in the books than in the films. The films, particularly in Deathly Hallows, present a storyline that seems almost to elevate Snape to a tragic hero, a character whose love transcends all boundaries. But this portrayal, while poignant, leaves out key elements of Snape's internal struggle, elements that shed light on the true reasons behind his actions. Snape's redemption in the films may be seen as the pursuit of love, but in the books, his actions are more about a desperate attempt to redeem himself for a mistake that haunted him for years, but not for the world, only for Lily. In the final scenes of the Deathly Hallows film, when Harry sees Snape's memories, the audience is introduced to a deeply romantic image of Snape's love for Lily Potter. The revelation of Snape's feelings for Lily is presented as a powerful, tragic love story that seems to explain everything about his sacrifices and his betrayal of Voldemort. This portrayal allows the viewer to see Snape as a man who had been scarred by a love that was unrequited, and as a result, he devoted himself entirely to protecting Harry Potter, seeing the boy as the last piece of Lily he could hold on to. In the film, Snape's sacrifices and decisions are framed as an act of redemption through love. The narrative becomes one of selflessness. Snape's love for Lily Potter drives him to protect her son, and in doing so, he is absolved of his previous wrongdoings. However, in the book, while Snape's love for Lily is undeniable, his motivations are far more complicated. Snape's journey toward redemption isn't purely driven by a love for Lily that seeks to prove him worthy in her eyes. Instead, it is rooted in guilt and shame. Snape's love for Lily, as tragic as it is interwoven with a deep desire to atone for his earlier actions. His devotion to her memory is a way of dealing with his failure to protect her, and his responsibility for her death. Snape doesn't make the choices he does in the book out of love for Harry or out of a desire to become a hero. His actions are motivated by an obsessive need to correct the mistake he made when he called the Death Eaters to Lily's house, resulting in her death. In the films, Snape's transformation from a feared, cold-hearted professor to a tragic, misunderstood hero is framed within the lens of love. He loved Lily, and for that he endured years of suffering. The film cuts out much of Snape's emotional complexity and internal conflict. It simplifies his suffering into a singular, easily digestible narrative: love as redemption. When Harry views Snape's memories in the pensieve, he sees a self-sacrificial Snape, a man whose love for Lily consumed him, turning him into a secret guardian angel for Harry. The film depicts Snape's actions as the result of a romanticized devotion. His pain and his fear of being unworthy of Lily become the driving force of his heroism. In the final movie, Snape's tragedy becomes the film's central emotional moment, serving as a metaphor for sacrifice and redemption without addressing the more complex and darker parts of his motivations. The books, however, reveal that Snape's relationship with Lily was far from idyllic. While Snape is undoubtedly haunted by his love for Lily, his journey of redemption is not just about proving his love for her, but about reconciling with the guilt he carries. Snape was the one who, in his youth, had made the call that led to the murder of Lily. He was the one who had allied with the Death Eaters, and it was his betrayal of her and his inability to save her that continued to torment him throughout his life. Snape does not act out of love for Harry alone. He acts out of an obsessive drive to make up for his role in Lily's death. The book emphasizes that Snape's regret is much deeper and more multifaceted than the film allows it to be. The turning point in Snape's character arc, as revealed in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, is not about love, but about guilt. When Snape first learns that Voldemort plans to kill Lily and James Potter, he is devastated, not because of his love for Lily, but because he has already sealed his fate as a member of the Death Eaters. He made the mistake of trusting Voldemort, and now he has to live with the consequences. The betrayal is not just of Lily, but of himself. Snape's desperation is born not only out of his romantic feelings for Lily, but from his realization that he has become a tool of a force he once pledged to fight. The moment Snape switches sides, it is not because he believes he can redeem himself through love, but because he recognizes that he cannot let another person die because of his mistakes. Number 14, Forgotten Moments with Dumbledore. With one of the most complex and tragic characters in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series is Severus Snape. He is a man torn between loyalty and betrayal, love and hatred, guilt and redemption. The films, however, often struggle to convey the depth of his internal conflict as portrayed in the books. One of the most poignant examples of this is the way his relationship with Albus Dumbledore is handled, especially the scene where Snape's motivations are laid bare, showing that much of his actions stem from guilt rather than a pure desire for righteousness. This moment, which is laden with tension, is pivotal in understanding the character of Severus Snape, but in the films it is either watered down or altered to present a less uncomfortable narrative. The rawness of his emotional turmoil, especially his feelings of betrayal, are softened, and instead Snape is depicted more as a tragic hero. In the books, one of the most chilling conversations between Snape and Dumbledore occurs when Snape is forced to confront the true nature of his motivations. In this scene, Dumbledore looks at Snape and tells him, "You feel guilt, not for the boy, but for Lily. You think you can somehow atone for her death by protecting Harry, but the boy, Harry, is still irrelevant to you." Dumbledore's words are like a slap in the face to Snape, forcing him to acknowledge that his deep and consuming hatred for Voldemort and his overwhelming sense of guilt over Lily Potter's death have shaped his actions, but not out of some idealistic sense of morality. Rather, Snape is driven by his own sorrow and regret, a desire to make up for a past mistake. In the book Snape, silence in response to Dumbledore's statement speaks volumes. It's not a silence born of shame, but one that reflects the painful truth. Snape is a man who is in turmoil, not because he is inherently evil, but because he is consumed by guilt over his role in Lily's death. The fact that Snape does not deny Dumbledore's accusation indicates that deep down, he knows that his motivations are not entirely noble. He's not acting out of pure selflessness or a desire to protect Harry, but because of his own unresolved grief and guilt. However, the films significantly alter this exchange. In the 2009 adaptation of Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, the conversation is presented differently. Snape's silence, which in the book is a raw admission of his true feelings, is glossed over in the movie. The tension in the room, which in the book is palpable, is softened, and there is no real exploration of Snape's self-loathing and emotional conflict. Instead, the scene in the film focuses on the idea that Snape is protecting Harry because of a sense of duty or because it is the right thing to do. This shift in the portrayal of Snape's motivations is a subtle yet significant change that impacts how we understand his character. While this shift may have been made to simplify the character of Snape for the audience or to emphasize his redemption arc, it takes away from the complexity of the man who is, in essence, deeply flawed. By removing the darker aspects of Snape's psyche, the films inadvertently strip away much of what makes him a tragic hero. His actions are no longer driven by an internal conflict between guilt and self-purification, but instead they become more about doing the right thing, which takes away the deep emotional complexity that made Snape such a compelling character. In the films, Snape's relationship with Dumbledore is also reframed as one of deep mutual respect. The idea that Snape is essentially serving Dumbledore even though he has his own personal motives is still present, but it's presented in a way that makes Snape look more like a loyal servant rather than a man motivated by a deeply personal and unresolved pain. The films portray Snape as a character who, despite his harsh exterior, is ultimately fighting for the greater good. Yet, in the books, we see a man who is doing so not just for noble reasons, but to make up for a failure that continues to haunt him. And this is not to say that the films do not try to portray Snape's complexity. There are still moments in the films where Snape's actions are questioned by other characters, particularly Harry, and it's clear that there is more to his character than meets the eye. The infamous scene where Snape kills Dumbledore is one of the most significant in the films, and it is meant to show Snape's commitment to his mission as well as his internal struggle. However, the film doesn't explore the full implications of this moment. Snape, Aufke's guilt over the betrayal of Dumbledore, the mentor who trusted him. The films take a much more straightforward approach to Snape's arc, which contrasts with the more nuanced and morally ambiguous portrayal found in the books. Number 15, the final duel with McGonagall. In the final Harry Potter film, The Deathly Hallows Part 2, there is a moment that stands out for its spectacle. Severus Snape, once feared and mistrusted, faces off against Professor Minerva McGonagall in a dramatic duel. The scene plays out with Snape seemingly reluctant to engage in a serious fight. His movements are more defensive, almost as if he is protecting something, and eventually he flees the battle without causing any harm. This cinematic moment was designed to show Snape in a new light. It is a pivotal moment in the film's effort to redeem his character, to present him as someone who, despite his past, is now on the side of good. His flight, which in the book was a simple act of escape, is transformed into a graceful, almost heroic retreat, a sacrifice of sorts in the eyes of the audience. The filmmakers aimed to give Snape a redemption arc to allow him to leave the battle without a trace of malice. However, J.K. Rowling's book presents a very different version of this sequence, and when Severus Snape flees from the battle, there is no grandeur, no defiance in his departure. He runs from the battlefield, not with dignity, but with a quiet recognition that his secret has been exposed and that the time for further deception has passed. In the novel, Snape does not engage in a duel with McGonagall. He doesn't fight back or defend himself. He simply disappears. He knows that his role in the war, which had always been one of espionage and subterfuge, is over. He knows that his double life is no longer sustainable, and so he escapes the place where he no longer has any power. In the film, this act of running away is reinterpreted for dramatic effect. The filmmakers wanted Snape's final moments to be filled with more than just fear and retreat. They wanted the audience to see him as a tragic figure, someone who had been fighting for the side of good all along, but had been misunderstood. By adding the duel with McGonagall, the filmmakers turned his departure into something noble, something that could be seen as a moment of internal conflict. Snape, in this version, is not just running away, he is making a sacrifice by choosing not to fight. He is showing restraint, proving that he is not the same man who once attacked students and participated in terrible acts. Instead of running in shame or fear, he is retreating in the name of something higher, peace, perhaps, or redemption. This shift from the book to the film reflects the broader changes made to Snape as character across the movies. In the book, Snape's complexity is conveyed through his inner turmoil and moral ambiguity. He is a man who works tirelessly on behalf of the light, but he does so from the shadows, and he pays a great personal cost for this. His actions are motivated by love and loyalty, but they are also driven by a deep sense of guilt. In the books, his final actions are seen as those of a man who has made terrible choices in his life, but who has always known the importance of making the right one at the cost of his own happiness. The filmmakers, however, took a different approach. They decided that Snape's ultimate act of bravery should be as visually striking and cinematic as possible. His betrayal of the Death Eaters and his final moments in Hogwarts were given the weight of sacrifice and noble defense. They wanted the audience to see him as a misunderstood hero, someone who had been playing a long game all along, and this scene with McGonagall was meant to solidify this redemption. In the film, when Snape flees, he does not look like a coward. He looks like someone who is reluctantly withdrawing from a conflict he never wanted to be part of. This change in the film is most noticeable when compared to the stark reality of Snape's flight in the book. There, Snape's departure is not an act of valor or heroism, but a quiet surrender to the truth. He is fully aware that his secret is no longer safe. The revelation that he was working with Dumbledore and was loyal to the Order of the Phoenix has been made. There is no longer any need for him to fight. His time as a spy has ended, and in that moment his only option is to leave. This is a Snape who has been trapped in a life of deception and is now faced with the only path left to him, escape. The contrast between these two portrayals of Snape's departure reflects the ongoing tension between the two versions of his character in the films and books. In the films, Snape is ultimately portrayed as a tragic hero, someone who makes painful choices in the service of a greater good. The films, particularly in their later installments, took great pains to showcase his sacrifices, portraying him as a figure of deep, unspoken nobility. The audience sees him as a man who is trying to atone for his past misdeeds and is willing to pay the ultimate price for it. This is a simplification of Snape's true character in the books, where his motivations are far more conflicted, his actions driven by an intense personal struggle rather than a desire for redemption. Number 16. The distorted scene of Dumbledore's murder. In the Harry Potter films, the death of Albus Dumbledore stands out as one of the most emotionally charged and dramatic moments in the series. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, this moment is staged to emphasize Severus Snape's internal struggle, portraying him as a man torn between his loyalty to Dumbledore and his darker obligations to Voldemort. The film version of the scene presents Snape as a reluctant assassin, almost tortured by the act of killing his mentor. His cold yet emotionally loaded gaze towards Dumbledore, followed by the whispered Avada Kedavra, creates an atmosphere of agonizing tension. The filmmakers crafted this portrayal to make Snape appear as a tragic figure, as if he were compelled to carry out this grisly act to fulfill a higher, though painful, mission. He is depicted as a martyr, sacrificing his own sense of morality for the greater good, in line with the narrative that would eventually unfold in the final book. However, this interpretation is in stark contrast to the way the scene plays out in J.K. Rowling's original text. In the book, Snape's actions are devoid of any external signs of inner conflict. His killing of Dumbledore is swift, clinical, and completely devoid of emotion. In fact, the narrative presents the murder in a chillingly detached manner. There is no sign of hesitation or suffering in Snape's behavior. Instead, he kills Dumbledore with cold efficiency, almost as if he were disgusted by the act, but not conflicted about it. His face is described not as pained, but as one that is resolute and unmoving, performing the task with chilling professionalism. Snape, in Rowling's version, does not linger on the action with guilt or remorse. Instead, he executes it with a coldness that suggests he is simply fulfilling a grim but necessary duty. The moment of Dumbledore, death is one of the most disturbing scenes in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. From Harry's perspective, hidden under the invisibility cloak, there is a sense of horror that builds as he watches Snape perform the act. In the book, Harry's thoughts as he witnesses the scene are crucial. Quote 24. This thought is not an embellishment or an exaggeration from Harry's perspective, but a gut-wrenching realization that Snape is not just carrying out the murder as a tragic necessity. The cold enjoyment that Harry perceives in Snape, his demeanor highlights a disturbing element of the character. Harry is not simply an observer of a necessary evil, he is watching a man who seems to take some perverse pleasure in the destruction of Dumbledore. This insight into Snape's character is pivotal to the reader, his understanding of him as a person capable of extreme actions, however much his loyalty to Dumbledore might later be revealed. The movie's portrayal of Snape as murder of Dumbledore creates a far more sympathetic image of the character. The filmmakers use cinematographic techniques to highlight the emotional torment of Snape. They slow down the pacing of the scene using close-up shots of Snape, then face to accentuate his apparent emotional turmoil. The music swells, creating a feeling of tragedy and inevitability. The moment when Snape casts the killing curse is framed not as an act of cold, calculated murder, but as an emotionally fraught sacrifice. In this version, Snape's face betrays his suffering, making him appear to be a reluctant agent of death, acting only out of some higher moral duty. The film version of the scene is designed to evoke sympathy for Snape, suggesting that he is in pain and fighting against the forces that are pushing him into this unthinkable act. This cinematic approach makes sense in the context of the film series, where Snape's complex motivations and eventual redemption are central to the narrative arc. By emphasizing Snape's apparent emotional conflict, the film sets up the later revelation of his true loyalty, allowing the audience to connect with the character on a deeper emotional level. The filmmakers want the audience to sympathize with Snape's position as a man forced to make agonizing decisions, giving him a depth that aligns with the twist that will later unfold in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. The portrayal of Snape in the films as a tragic hero reinforces the themes of self-sacrifice and moral ambiguity that are explored in the later books. The decision to highlight Snape's internal struggle is a narrative choice that resonates with the overarching themes of the story, as it underscores the idea that even the most seemingly villainous characters can harbor hidden depths of loyalty and compassion. Yet, this dramatic reinterpretation comes at a cost. The film version of the scene diminishes the moral complexity that Rowling's original portrayal offers. In the book, Snape's actions are not portrayed as a grand sacrifice, but rather as the execution of a cold, calculated decision. There is no room for heroism in his actions, rather they are portrayed as part of the morally ambiguous world in which the characters live. The tension between what is right and what is necessary is explored through Snape's actions, which in the book are much more morally complex than the film allows. By presenting Snape as a martyr in the film, the filmmakers risk oversimplifying the ethical ambiguity of his character, turning him into a tragic figure whose actions are justified by his ultimate loyalty to Dumbledore. In the book, Snape's motivations are far more layered, leaving the reader to grapple with the full complexity of his character, a complexity that the film S. portrayal barely touches. The contrast between the film and the book is particularly striking when considering the emotional stakes for Harry. In the film, Harry's emotional response to Dumbledore's death is one of utter devastation, but also of a sense of helplessness in the face of Snape's apparent inner torment. The movie version encourages the audience to feel sympathy for Snape, viewing him as a victim of circumstance. The film ends the scene with a shot of Snape running away, his expression filled with anguish, reinforcing the sense that he is a tortured soul, forced to make impossible choices. This portrayal creates a sense of finality in Snape's character arc, making his eventual redemption feel like a necessary and fulfilling resolution to his internal struggle. The movie's interpretation provides closure for Snape's character, presenting him as a tragic hero whose actions were driven by a higher, noble purpose. In contrast, Harry's reaction in the book is far more raw and unfiltered. The book allows for a more complicated, uncomfortable engagement with Snape's character. As Harry watches Snape murder Dumbledore, he feels a mix of betrayal, confusion, and hatred. In the book, Harry's sense of betrayal is compounded by the realization that Snape has been playing a far more dangerous game than he initially believed. Rather than portraying Snape as a tragic hero, the book version emphasizes his role as an antagonist, one whose actions are driven by complex, often dark motivations. Harry's internal conflict is not just about grief for Dumbledore, but also about the disillusionment he feels towards Snape, whose true nature is hidden beneath a veil of secrecy and manipulation. The book portrayal leaves Harry and the reader with more questions than answers, creating a deeper emotional and moral complexity that the film glosses over. The film's approach to Snape as character ultimately aims to make his later redemption feel more poignant and earned. By depicting him as a reluctant murderer, the filmmakers set up the character's eventual transformation, framing Snape's actions as a result of his inner struggle between love and duty. This version of Snape, while more sympathetic, also reduces the sharp edges of his character, making him appear more as a tragic hero than a morally ambiguous figure. The film sacrifices some of the moral complexity found in the book for the sake of emotional resonance, crafting a more straightforward narrative that plays into the audience's desire for redemption. In the end, the difference in how Snape's character is portrayed in the book versus the film reflects the larger differences in how the two mediums approach moral complexity. While the book allows for a more nuanced, uncomfortable exploration of Snape's motivations, the film simplifies his character arc to create a more emotionally satisfying narrative. Both versions have their merits, but the film's portrayal of Snape's killing of Dumbledore remains a striking example of how the adaptation process reshapes the source material, emphasizing emotional payoff over moral ambiguity. Number 17, missing school memories of cruelty. In the magical world of Harry Potter, Severus Snape is one of the most complex and debated characters. His role in the series is multifaceted, and much of his development, especially regarding his past, comes through a contrast between the books and the films. While J.K. Rowling's books present a detailed, often harsh portrayal of Snape's youth, the films attempt to create a more sympathetic, almost romanticized image of the character, particularly by omitting critical elements of his past. One of the most significant aspects of this, quote 28, of Snape's character is the absence of memories that showcase his earlier cruelty and dangerous fascinations. The films focus on his victimization at the hands of James Potter, a portrayal that subtly distorts Snape's complex nature and intentions. In the books, Snape's adolescent years were far from innocent or pure. He was a student at Hogwarts with a notorious reputation, one not just for being a talented wizard, but for his dangerous interests in the dark arts. The novels are filled with accounts of Snape's involvement in dark magic, which goes far beyond mere curiosity. His skill in creating harmful spells, including the infamous Sectum Sempra, reveals a side of Snape that is far more sinister than what is portrayed in the films. In fact, it is through the discovery of this curse by Harry that the true extent of Snape's darker tendencies becomes evident, as Harry uses it against Draco Malfoy in an impulsive, almost vengeful moment. The curse, which causes severe damage to its victim, is a reflection of Snape's earlier interests, which, as revealed by his memories, were steeped in malevolent magic. Yet in the films, Snape's early years are portrayed with a notable absence of this darkness. The films depict him as a shy, socially awkward boy who is simply a victim of James Potter's bullying. This portrayal, although rooted in part in the truth of Snape's experiences with James, misses the larger picture of Snape's own moral failings. The films lean heavily into the idea of Snape as a victim, a misfit who, despite his brilliance, is an outcast because of his awkward demeanor and his unrequited love for Lily Potter. His infatuation with Lily is undoubtedly tragic, but it serves to diminish the broader, more troubling aspects of his personality. Snape is shown to be a reluctant hero, but his actions as a student, his alliances with dark figures like Bellatrix Lestrange and Lucius Malfoy, and his dark magic are not given the attention they deserve. The key omission in the films is the complete lack of focus on Snape as relationships with others during his school years, particularly his ties to future Death Eaters. In the books, Severus Snape is shown to have befriended and been influenced by individuals who would later become infamous followers of Lord Voldemort. Characters such as Lucius Malfoy and Bellatrix Lestrange were not just distant figures to Snape, they were part of his inner circle, and their shared interests in dark magic were what initially bound them together. These were not simple teenage friendships. They were alliances formed on shared ideals of power, dominance, and the pursuit of forbidden knowledge. The films, however, portray these relationships as secondary or even non-existent, focusing instead on Snape's unrequited love for Lily, which conveniently overshadows his darker tendencies. In the books, Snape's actions are more complex and morally ambiguous. For example, his first interaction with Harry is tainted by the knowledge that Snape had been, in his youth, the instigator of some of the darker aspects of Hogwarts life. Snape had no qualms about using magic to harm others, as shown in his obsession with creating and using curses that could inflict real damage. His disdain for Harry, then, is not simply about the rivalry between them or Harry. Its resemblance to his father, it is also about Harry's lack of understanding of the real dangers Snape had been involved in during his time as a student. The film's treatment of Snape, however, diminishes the importance of this aspect of his past. Instead of confronting his dark history head-on, the films make Snape's actions seem more like a misunderstood adolescent phase, stripping away the more dangerous and troubling elements that the books portray. The absence of these darker memories and their implications is a key factor in how the films attempt to, quote 32, Snape Snape's character. In Rowling's books, Snape's behavior during his youth is far more morally questionable than the films would have viewers believe. It's easy to see how the films, aiming for a more dramatic and emotionally charged narrative, chose to focus on Snape's tragic love story with Lily and his later turn to the light, yet this simplification leaves out much of his sinister nature. Snape is shown as a deeply troubled man, certainly, but his earlier actions in the books are much more unforgivable and less excusable than the films allow us to think. A particularly telling example of the film's attempts to downplay Snape's darker tendencies occurs during the pensive scene, where Harry witnesses Snape's memories of being bullied by James Potter. In the film, this moment is portrayed with a focus on sympathy for Snape. We see him as a victim, a boy who is treated poorly and misunderstood, but this scene, while tragic, omits the fact that Snape's later actions were not simply a reaction to bullying. In the books, Snape's decision to follow Voldemort was not just about revenge for being bullied, it was also about his fascination with power, control, and the dark magic that Voldemort offered him. This aspect of Snape's character is absent from the film, leaving him more as a tragic figure and less as someone who made dark, calculated choices for his own gain. The films also miss an important part of Snape's relationship with Lily Potter. While the films focus on his unrequited love for her, they gloss over the fact that Snape's actions, even as an adult, were influenced by the anger and betrayal he felt when Lily chose James over him. Snape's actions towards Harry and his eventual role as a double agent are driven not just by guilt and redemption, but by a desire to control and exert influence over those who wronged him. The films present Snape as the ultimate hero, sacrificing his life for Harry, but in doing so they downplay the complexity of his motives. They fail to show how his character is shaped not just by his love for Lily, but by his ambition, his bitterness, and his need for power. The films reduce Snape's role to that of a tragic hero, omitting the essential elements of his earlier life that made him who he was. In the end, the film's portrayal of Severus Snape is, in many ways, a distortion of the character that J.K. Rowling created. While Snape is undoubtedly a tragic figure, his past is far darker and more complicated than the films suggest. The films attempt to make him more sympathetic by omitting crucial parts of his youth, including his interest in dark magic, his connections to future Death Eaters, and his morally questionable actions as a student. These omissions create a portrayal of Snape that focuses on his suffering and redemption, but leaves out the dangerous, even malevolent aspects of his character. By doing so, the films present Snape as more of a romanticized hero, rather than the deeply flawed and conflicted character that he is in the books. Number 18. No criticism from other characters. In the world of Harry Potter, Severus Snape is one of the most complex and divisive characters, shaped by his actions and the perception others have of him. Throughout the books, Snape is seen as a deeply conflicted figure, often surrounded by suspicion and mistrust. His role as a double agent, caught between the forces of good and evil, creates a constant tension within the narrative. His interactions with other characters are marked by suspicion, hostility, and open conflict. Yet when translated to film, these dynamics are considerably softened. The harsh criticism that Snape faces in the books is almost entirely absent in the movies, where his character is portrayed in a more sympathetic light. This difference between the books and the films raises important questions about how the adaptation process alters our understanding of Snape as character and his journey from villain to hero. In the books, many characters openly criticize Snape's behavior, questioning his loyalty and his motivations. For instance, Tonks, a member of the Order of the Phoenix, is uncomfortable around Snape and expresses her doubts about him. She is not alone in her suspicions. Molly Weasley, who is fiercely protective of her family, also views Snape with deep distrust, constantly reminding others of his past and his association with dark magic. Even Arthur Weasley, despite his typically gentle nature, does not entirely trust Snape and is wary of his actions. These characters, all of whom play important roles in Harry's life, are not shy about their skepticism towards Snape. Their criticism serves as a constant reminder to both Harry and the reader that Snape's true allegiance is never entirely clear. The teachers at Hogwarts are similarly cautious. Professor Flitwick, known for his kindness and gentle demeanour, is cautious around Snape, as is Hagrid, who, despite his warm-hearted nature, cannot shake the feeling that Snape is not to be trusted. Professor McGonagall, ever the stern and just figure, goes even further. Her disdain for Snape is palpable, and her open confrontations with him in the books highlight the tension between them. McGonagall, a loyal member of Dumbledore's inner circle, is deeply disturbed by Snape's behaviour and actions, which she views as a potential threat to the safety of the students and the integrity of the school. These conflicts between Snape and the other teachers add a layer of complexity to his character, showing that even those closest to Dumbledore are not always certain of his true nature. Snape's interactions with the students are also marked by his harsh and unforgiving demeanour. His treatment of Harry Potter, in particular, is cruel and disdainful, and his bias against the Gryffindors is well documented. Snape's personal vendetta against Harry is rooted in his deep hatred of Harry's father, James Potter, and his jealousy over the attention and admiration that Harry receives. This animosity is evident throughout the books, with Snape going to great lengths to make Harry's life at Hogwarts as difficult as possible. In the films, however, Snape's cruelty toward Harry is often downplayed, making their relationship seem more neutral than it actually is in the books. In contrast to the rich depiction of Snape's relationships in the books, the films present a much more heroic portrayal of him. There is a clear attempt to soften the character's edges, turning him into a misunderstood anti-hero rather than a figure of suspicion and conflict. The film's portrayal of Snape as a tragic hero who works in the shadows for the greater good ignores the fact that his actions in the books often provoke strong reactions from those around him. The criticism he faces from other characters is toned down or completely omitted, making it seem as though Snape is universally respected and trusted by his peers, when in reality this was far from the case. One specific example of this shift can be found in the portrayal of Snape's relationship with Harry Potter. In the books, Harry's hatred for Snape is one of the central driving forces of the narrative. Harry's animosity towards Snape is rooted in the belief that Snape is a villain and a threat to his safety and the safety of his friends. And this dynamic is explored in great detail, with Snape's harsh treatment of Harry serving as a constant reminder of the deep-seated conflict between them. However, in the films, this animosity is downplayed. While Harry still harbours resentment towards Snape, the films largely focus on Snape's eventual redemption, with little attention paid to the years of torment and mistrust that came before it. The films also make a deliberate choice to reduce the complexity of Snape as character. In the books, Snape's journey is fraught with internal conflict as he grapples with his loyalties to both Dumbledore and Voldemort. His ultimate decision to side with Dumbledore is a result of years of turmoil and difficult choices, and his redemption is earned through his actions, not just his final revelation. However, in the films, Snape's internal struggles are often overshadowed by his role as the secret protector of Harry. His past actions, particularly his harsh treatment of Harry and his association with the Death Eaters, are largely glossed over, making his eventual sacrifice seem more like an inevitable act of heroism than the culmination of a long and painful journey. The absence of criticism from other characters also robs the audience of an important perspective on Snape's actions. In the books, Snape is not simply a misunderstood hero. He is a deeply flawed individual whose actions have consequences for those around him. The criticism he faces from his colleagues and fellow members of the Order of the Phoenix serves to remind the reader that even those who fight for the greater good can be tainted by their past actions. The films, by removing much of this criticism, present a more sanitized version of Snape, one that fits neatly into the narrative of the tragic hero. This decision ultimately diminishes the complexity of his character and reduces the impact of his eventual redemption. The portrayal of Snape in the films also omits much of the nuance in his relationship with Dumbledore. In the books, Snape's loyalty to Dumbledore is never a given. He constantly questions Dumbledore's decisions and is frequently frustrated by the secrecy and manipulation that surrounds their relationship. His ultimate sacrifice is a result of his deep love for Lily Potter, and his loyalty to Dumbledore is built on a foundation of guilt and regret rather than unwavering devotion. The films, however, reduce this relationship to a simple one of blind loyalty, with little exploration of the emotional complexity that underpins their bond. One of the most glaring examples of this simplification can be found in Snape's death scene. In the books, Snape's death is a moment of intense emotional weight, as Harry finally learns the truth about Snape's role in his life. The revelation that Snape was working for Dumbledore all along and that he loved Lily Potter adds a layer of complexity to his character that is missing in the films. In the movie adaptation, however, Snape's death is portrayed as a heroic moment, with little attention paid to the emotional turmoil that Snape experienced in the lead-up to his death. His sacrifice is reduced to a simple act of heroism rather than the tragic culmination of years of emotional struggle. In the books, Snape is not an unquestionable hero, but rather a character who must earn his redemption through his actions. His path to redemption is long and fraught with difficulty, and his mistakes are not easily forgiven. The films, however, depict Snape as a hero from the moment he switches sides, making his journey seem much more straightforward and heroic. And this oversimplification of Snape's character detracts from the emotional depth of his story and undermines the complexity of his relationships with the other characters. Ultimately, the film's portrayal of Snape as a misunderstood hero who is largely free from criticism is a significant departure from his characterization in the books. By removing much of the criticism and suspicion that Snape faces from other characters, the films present a version of Snape that is more palatable to the audience, but also less complex and less compelling. In the books, Snape is a deeply flawed and conflicted character who must navigate a difficult path toward redemption. In the films, he is a tragic hero whose actions are almost entirely justified, making his journey seem simpler and more straightforward. This shift in perspective changes the way we view Snape's character and diminishes the impact of his ultimate sacrifice. Number 19. Simplified portrayal of Harry's attitude after Snape. Death. In the Harry Potter film series, the character of Severus Snape undergoes a notable transformation in how he is perceived by both the audience and Harry Potter himself. This shift in perspective is most evident in the final scenes of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Part 2, where Harry, standing in front of Snape's grave, reflects with reverence on the professor's life and actions, declaring, "He was the bravest man I ever knew." This statement, although emotionally charged, reveals much about the way the film simplifies Snape's character arc and his complex moral journey. In the books, however, the revelation of Snape's true allegiance and his role in the fight against Voldemort is not something that Harry accepts immediately. J.K. Rowling takes great care in showing how our misunderstanding of Snape evolves over time, emphasizing the emotional and intellectual process involved in forgiving someone who had been his tormentor for so many years. Harry's perception of Snape is clouded by years of bitterness and personal animosity. The truth about Snape's loyalties does not come to light until the final moments of the series, when Snape's memories are revealed to Harry in the pensive. These memories showcase Snape's love for Harry's mother Lily, and the incredible sacrifice he made in choosing to protect Harry, even at the cost of his own safety and reputation. The films, on the other hand, condense this gradual journey into a single, almost immediate moment of realization and acceptance. Harry's line in the final film serves as an elegant resolution to Snape's character arc, but it glosses over the years of emotional turmoil Harry experiences. The films make it seem as though Harry's forgiveness is swift, following Snape's death without much room for the internal struggle that is so central to the books. The simplification of Snape's character in this regard diminishes the complexity of his journey from antagonist to hero. In the books, Harry wrestles with the notion of forgiveness for a long time before he can fully comprehend Snape's actions. It is only after seeing the truth in Snape's memories and reflecting on them that he is able to piece together the man's complicated and ultimately heroic nature. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Harry's transformation is gradual, and much of this internal shift happens in the presence of others. He discusses his revelations with Hermione and Ron, each of whom reacts differently to Snape's motivations. This open dialogue about Snape's sacrifice allows Harry to process the enormity of Snape's decisions, and he doesn't arrive at his final judgment about Snape easily. The moment of realization that Snape was, in fact, working on the side of the light, driven by love and remorse, is a profound one for Harry. It is a culmination of years of complex emotions, hate, admiration, fear, and guilt, all of which are addressed in Harry's slow understanding. The films, in contrast, give viewers a more streamlined approach to Snape's redemption. Harry's proclamation of Snape's bravery in the movie serves as a quick and cathartic conclusion to a lengthy moral conundrum. It removes the ambiguity that pervades Snape's character in the books, where the question of whether he was a true hero or just a man who made one good choice is far less clear. The films treat Snape's character as if his heroic deeds overshadow all his prior wrongdoings, when, in reality, the complexity of his actions is precisely what makes Snape such a fascinating and tragic figure in the book series. In the books, Snape's relationship with Harry is defined by a series of fraught encounters, each laden with personal history. Harry's deep-seated hatred for Snape, fostered by years of mistreatment and abuse, makes it nearly impossible for him to see Snape in a positive light, even when presented with the truth. The notion of Snape as a brave and self-sacrificial figure is not one that Harry arrives at quickly or easily. He spends a great deal of time questioning Snape's motives, especially after discovering the truth about Snape's love for Lily Potter and the pain that drove him to his actions. Even after this revelation, Harry is left to confront his feelings about a man who for years had been his nemesis. His reflection on Snape's life is complex, layered with conflicting emotions. The books present Snape as a man who is both deeply flawed and deeply noble, a combination that makes him one of the most intricate characters in the series. In contrast, the films tend to oversimplify Snape's moral complexity by reducing his arc to the ultimate expression of self-sacrifice. By framing Snape as an almost saintly figure upon his death, the films deny the viewer the opportunity to reflect on the true weight of Snape's actions. There is little space in the films for a nuanced exploration of Snape's motives, his inner conflict, and the heavy cost of his choices. This is particularly evident in the way Harry's forgiveness is presented. In the book, Harry comes to terms with Snape's actions only after understanding the profound personal suffering that Snape endured. It is a long and difficult journey for Harry, one that requires him to grapple with his own assumptions and biases. The films, by contrast, reduce this process to a single moment, robbing both Harry and the audience of the chance to truly engage with the moral ambiguity of Snape as character. Moreover, the films miss an important opportunity to explore how Snape, as sacrifice, while noble, does not absolve him of his earlier cruelty. Snape's actions, particularly his treatment of Harry and his role as a member of the Death Eaters, cannot be easily forgotten. His cruelty was not without reason. He was deeply wounded by his past, by the death of Lily Potter, and by his own deep-seated fears. However, the books never allow us to forget that Snape was not a perfect hero, and his journey was one of redemption, not complete absolution. The films, by simplifying this moral journey, give the impression that Snape's actions can be easily excused because of the noble end he achieved. This conclusion undermines the complexity of his character and removes the moral weight that is so crucial in the books. In The Half-Blood Prince, Snape and Secret Allegiance is a source of tension and mystery. The book carefully reveals Snape's true nature over time, building up to the devastating revelation that Snape was, in fact, a double agent working on behalf of Dumbledore. This slow reveal is essential to understanding the full complexity of Snape's character. The books give us insight into Snape's mind and motivations, allowing us to see how he balances his role as a spy and his personal pain. The films, by contrast, speed up this process, leaving out many of the moments that show Snape's internal conflict and moral ambiguity. This accelerates Harry's understanding of Snape, making it less emotionally impactful. The film series, in its attempt to make Snape a more sympathetic figure, also ignores the broader context of Snape's role within the larger battle between good and evil. While his love for Lily and his desire to protect Harry make him a tragic hero, they do not erase the fact that Snape was complicit in many of the darker actions of the wizarding world. The films portray Snape as a martyr-like figure, sacrificing himself for the greater good. but they fail to adequately explore the moral cost of his actions. The books, however, insist that Snape's journey is one of redemption, not unqualified sainthood. Harry's forgiveness of Snape, as presented in the films, is swift and almost too easy. It suggests that Snape's bravery and sacrifice outweigh his flaws and transgressions, a simplification that undermines the complexity of both Snape's character and Harry's own emotional journey. In the books, Harry's understanding of Snape's actions is far more complicated. His forgiveness comes not from a single act of heroism, but from a slow and painful process of coming to terms with the man Snape was and the sacrifices he made. The films, by contrast, strip away this complexity, offering a quick and tidy resolution to a character arc that was anything but simple. In the final analysis, the films present a view of Snape that is more palatable, less ambiguous, and more easily accepted by the audience. However, this simplification comes at the expense of the emotional depth and moral complexity that the books offer. By reducing Snape's character arc to a moment of quick forgiveness, the films rob the audience of the opportunity to truly reflect on the choices Snape made and the difficult journey he underwent to become a hero. In doing so, they diminish the very thing that made Snape such a compelling and tragic figure in the first place. Number 20, the idealized physical appearance. In the Harry Potter films, Severus Snape is depicted as a tragic hero, shrouded in mystery, with a deeply charismatic aura that appeals to viewers and invites them to sympathize with his character. The actor who portrayed him, Alan Rickman, delivered an impeccable performance, infusing Snape with a cold, commanding presence. His deep voice resonated with authority, and his every movement, from the purposeful sweep of his dark cloak to the steely gaze of his eyes, conveyed a sense of grandeur. This portrayal presented Snape not as a villain, but as someone whose complexity and hidden pain rendered him a more sympathetic figure. The aesthetic, almost gothic heroism created on screen veered away from the harsh and unpleasant reality depicted in J.K. Rowling's books, crafting an image of a man more tragic than sinister. In the films, Snape was always sharply dressed, his attire dark and imposing, enhancing the idea of him as a gothic anti-hero. His stature, his calculated movements, and even the heavy atmosphere surrounding him all worked to construct a visually appealing character. The filmmakers, under the direction of Chris Columbus, Alfonso Cuarón, Mike Newell, and David Yates, carefully shaped Snape's cinematic presence to make him almost magnetic to the audience. His somber demeanor, accentuated by Rickman's delivery, made him an enigmatic figure, evoking sympathy even as he committed questionable actions. He was portrayed as an individual who had faced suffering, yet managed to persevere. The sense of mystery surrounding his motives was amplified, urging viewers to question whether Snape was truly a villain, or if he was, in fact, a misunderstood hero. In contrast, the books provide a far less flattering image of Snape's appearance and overall demeanor. J.K. Rowling's description of Severus Snape is far more grotesque, emphasizing his physical repulsiveness. He is described as having greasy black hair, a hooked nose, and sallow skin, characteristics that evoke disgust rather than admiration. Snape's appearance is so unappealing that it immediately sets him apart from the more likable and approachable characters in the series. His unkempt look, combined with his dark personality, created an image that elicited fear and unease from students at Hogwarts. Quote to Order 45. The book notes, reflecting the true nature of the character, one who could never truly be considered, Pilas, quote, 46, or Yuki, quote, 47. One of the most striking differences between the film and the book is how Snape's physical appearance is used to emphasize his role in the story. In the book, Snape's unattractive appearance reflects his bitter and vengeful nature. His greasy hair and pale, unhealthy complexion symbolize his emotional and psychological isolation. He is a man who has been hurt deeply, and his appearance is a direct reflection of the self-inflicted wounds he carries. The characters around him, including Harry, Hermione, and Ron, are repelled by Snape's unpleasant exterior, reinforcing the idea that Snape is not a character meant to be immediately liked or understood. In fact, Rowling's description of Snape, West's unsettling presence, serves as a metaphor for the way in which he isolates himself emotionally from others, a man haunted by his past and unwilling to open up. The film's choice to beautify Snape with the help of Rickman's distinguished features and to present him with an air of grandeur takes away much of this symbolic depth. In the movie, viewers see a man with a certain magnetism, which, while effective for the film's narrative, dilutes the true impact of Snape's complexity. In many ways, Rickman's performance offers a more romanticized view of Snape, transforming him from a deeply flawed, almost villainous figure into one of tragic nobility. The dark, brooding intensity remains, but the films never fully embrace the unpleasantness of Snape's appearance and demeanor, as described in the book. The film's Snape is more charismatic, a kind of tortured soul whose mysterious nature seems to be the result of the weight of the world bearing down upon him. This romanticized portrayal clouds the uncomfortable reality that Snape's actions and appearance are linked, that his own self-loathing is evident in every aspect of his being. An example of this alteration can be seen in the scenes where Snape's role as a professor is put to the test. In the book, Snape's interactions with his students are often cold, cruel, and at times even malicious. His treatment of Harry in particular is harsh, and he goes out of his way to humiliate him whenever possible. Snape is never portrayed as a man of compassion or understanding. His interactions with the students are filled with sharp barbs and biting remarks. He is, to many, a figure to be feared. This fear is not only based on his authority, but on his grotesque and unappealing nature, an embodiment of the bitterness and resentment that has shaped him. For example, when Harry and Snape first meet, Snape is described as having a sardonic smile, which emphasizes his cruelty and dismissiveness towards Harry. This creates an image of a man who, while not inherently evil, has allowed his anger and frustration to manifest in his physical appearance and treatment of others. However, in the films, Snape's relationship with Harry is presented in a more sympathetic light. While his actions are still harsh, there is a subtle shift in how his cruelty is interpreted. In many of the scenes, Snape's voice conveys vulnerability, and his expressions, subtle but poignant, suggest a hidden depth of emotion. The audience is invited to feel a sense of empathy for him, rather than the disdain that his literary counterpart might provoke. The visual composition of these scenes, paired with Rickman's delivery, transforms Snape from a figure of disdain into one of melancholy. The film's portrayal suggests that Snape's harshness is a product of his own inner turmoil, a man caught in a web of loyalty and regret. The changes to Snape's image are not confined to his physical appearance alone. His overall aura in the films is one of quiet dignity despite the ruthless actions he sometimes takes. He is a man who, despite his outward coldness, commands respect. His role as a teacher and protector of Harry, though not fully apparent at first, slowly emerges as the films unfold. The final revelation of Snape's true loyalty in the last film, where he is revealed to be working against Voldemort all along, further cements this idealized image of him as a martyr, a man who made sacrifices for the greater good. This idealized heroism stands in stark contrast to the much darker portrayal of Snape in the books, where his flaws and mistakes are not just forgiven, but are woven into the fabric of his character. In the books, Snape's self-imposed isolation is never truly overcome, and his role as a protector is not so clearly defined until the very end. His actions are motivated by complex emotions, love, guilt, and remorse, but they are often overshadowed by his own bitterness. The films, however, take these complexities and cast them in a softer, more forgiving light. Snape's character is transformed into someone whose true nature was hidden behind layers of complexity, much of which was not immediately apparent to Harry or the audience. The films gloss over the reality of Snape's cruelty, focusing instead on his moments of vulnerability, thus presenting a more idealized version of the character. Despite these differences, Snape's evolution in the films reflects the filmmaker's desire to create a more palatable, sympathetic character for a wide audience. While the books provide a more unsettling and layered portrayal of Snape, the films opt for a more cinematic approach, focusing on emotional resonance rather than the harsh realities of his character. The result is a character who, while still deeply flawed, is ultimately portrayed in a much more heroic light. The tragic nature of Snape's story is still present, but it is framed in a way that invites the audience to forgive him and even admire him. In the end, the films succeed in transforming Snape from a cold and intimidating figure into a character whose pain and suffering resonate with viewers, making him one of the most complex and beloved characters in the entire Harry Potter series. Number 21. Silence about cowardice in his youth. In the world of Harry Potter, few characters are as complex and misunderstood as Severus Snape. While much has been written about his transformation from a seemingly antagonistic figure to a tragic hero, the film adaptations of J.K. Rowling's series offer a portrayal of Snape that differs significantly from the original books. One of the most glaring omissions is the portrayal of Snape's youth, where the films gloss over a crucial aspect of his character. His cowardice as a young man, a characteristic that shaped his actions and choices later in life. In the books, Severus Snape's decision to join Lord Voldemort's ranks is not driven by a deep-seated belief in the Dark Lord's ideology, but by a fear of the power and influence held by others. As a young boy, Snape was not the confident, cunning Slytherin that we later come to recognize. He was deeply insecure, lonely, and above all, frightened. When Snape first met the future Death Eaters, such as Lucius Malfoy and Avery, he was not an aspiring leader, but rather a boy desperately trying to fit in. He sought acceptance, not out of a desire for power, but from sheer necessity, hoping that aligning with the more dominant figures in his life would provide him with some measure of security. This fear of those around him is never fully explored in the films. The books make it clear that Snape was not the bold, self-assured character the movies often present him to be. Instead, he was motivated by a deep-seated fear of rejection, of being outcast, of being weak. He joined the Death Eaters not because he believed in their cause, but because he feared the consequences of standing against them. In his own words, he was 54, and he believed that being with the Death Eaters and aligning himself with their power was the safest option for a boy who had known little but bullying and isolation. The films, however, completely sidestep this aspect of Snape's character. Instead of highlighting his vulnerability, they craft him as a figure of strength, even nobility, whose decisions are portrayed as the result of his deep moral convictions. The audience is led to believe that Snape's actions, including his decision to remain with the Death Eaters during Voldemort's reign, were driven by a calculated, deliberate alignment with the Dark Lord's ideology. The complexity of his choice is downplayed. He is not shown as someone seeking protection and survival through affiliation, but rather as a strong-willed individual making a conscious decision to act. This shift in characterization is particularly evident in the depiction of Snape's interactions with James Potter, Harry's father. In the books, it is clear that Snape harbors deep resentment towards James, but this resentment stems not just from the rivalry between the two, but also from Snape's own feelings of inferiority and powerlessness. James, the confident and popular Gryffindor, symbolizes everything Snape was not: brave, admired, and secure in his place in the world. James's bullying of Snape, particularly in the instance where he humiliated Snape in front of Lily Evans, is a defining moment in Snape's life. But the films make it appear as though Snape's hatred of James was rooted in a personal vendetta, as though it was simply the result of a personality clash between two individuals with opposing traits. In reality, Snape's resentment was born of fear and humiliation. James represented the kind of power and confidence that Snape could never have. In his youth, Snape was not the imposing figure we see later in life. He was a man who was often overwhelmed by the expectations and cruelties of those around him. James's popularity was something that Snape could never aspire to, and this difference, more than any inherent rivalry, contributed to Snape's bitterness. The films also obscure the fact that Snape was not an ideological follower of Voldemort, but rather a person desperately trying to fit in with those who he believed held the key to his survival. While the books emphasize Snape's willingness to follow the Dark Lord in the hope of gaining power and protection, the films tend to gloss over the fact that this choice was primarily motivated by fear. The films portray Snape as a stoic, almost idealized figure who makes his choices from a place of deep conviction. Yet in the books he was more of a survivor, a man who joined the Death Eaters not because he believed in their cause, but because he feared the consequences of standing alone. One of the most significant moments that the films overlook is Snape's deep sense of fear when he is forced to make his allegiance to Voldemort known. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Snape makes the unbreakable vow to Narcissa Malfoy, pledging to protect Draco and, if necessary, kill Dumbledore. The films depict this moment as a show of loyalty to the Dark Lord, but the books reveal the deep anxiety Snape feels as he makes this vow. He is not a man of firm resolve in that moment, but one torn between the need to appear loyal to Voldemort and the fear of the consequences of failing the Dark Lord. The idea that Snape's loyalty was born out of fear rather than ideological devotion is essential to understanding his motivations and actions later in the series. In the Deathly Hallows, Snape's true loyalty to Dumbledore is revealed, and while the films do hint at his feelings for Lily Potter, they fail to capture the full depth of Snape's internal struggle. his fear of Voldemort's power, and his desperate desire to prove his worth to Dumbledore are vital components of his character that the films failed to emphasize. The Snape we see in the films is, for the most part, the Snape who has already undergone a transformation, who has found redemption. But the journey to that redemption, fraught with his fear of rejection, is absent from the films. Even Snape's decision to spy for Dumbledore is presented in a way that removes much of the original complexity. In the books, Snape's decision to betray Voldemort was not made out of love for Lily Potter alone. It was the culmination of years of fear, regret, and a growing desire to redeem himself in Dumbledore's eyes. Snape knew that his position as a double agent was precarious and that his life was at constant risk. This dangerous position was not a result of noble self-sacrifice, but of his desperate attempts to survive in a world that had always treated him as inferior. Snape's role as a double agent was not simply a choice between good and evil, but one of survival and a quest for personal redemption. The portrayal of Snape in the films, however, simplifies his journey into a clear narrative of good versus evil. By stripping away the layers of fear, insecurity, and cowardice that defined his youth, the films present Snape as a man who had always been in control of his destiny, even if that control was often obscured by his actions. This sanitized version of Snape's character, which ignores his early cowardice and his emotional struggle, undermines the complexity of his ultimate redemption. In conclusion, the films do a disservice to Severus Snape by ignoring the crucial role that fear and self-doubt played in shaping his decisions and actions. The Snape we see on screen is a far cry from the Snape of the books, where the character's insecurities, his struggle for survival, and his deep-seated fear of rejection were central to understanding his journey from a frightened young man to a tragic hero. By omitting these elements, the films present a more palatable version of Snape, one that fits the narrative of the heroic redemption arc, but in doing so, they miss the deeper, more tragic truths of his character. Number 22, lack of deeper analysis of his teaching failures. The image of Severus Snape in the Harry Potter films is, in many ways, a complex and multifaceted one. However, when we examine the portrayal of Snape as a teacher, one of the most glaring omissions in the films is the lack of a true exploration of his profound pedagogical failings. In J.K. Rowling's novels, Snape is a teacher who terrorizes his students, undermines their self-esteem, and runs a classroom steeped in fear and humiliation. The films, however, choose to soften these aspects of his character, presenting him more as a stern, but ultimately misunderstood, authority figure. This transformation from book to screen shifts the narrative in a way that diminishes the depth of his flaws and obscures the impact of his behavior on his students. In the books, Snape's approach to teaching is far from inspiring or nurturing. He does not encourage his students to think critically or explore the subjects he teaches with curiosity. Instead, he thrives on domination and control, relying on intimidation to maintain power over the classroom. His behavior towards his students, particularly those from Gryffindor, is a textbook example of how not to teach. For instance, in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Snape makes a point of humiliating Harry, Hermione, and Ron in front of the class. His cruel remarks and mockery do nothing to foster a sense of academic curiosity, but rather serve to break the students down, forcing them to feel inferior and worthless. Snape's approach to teaching is not merely harsh discipline, It is an active destruction of his students' confidence. He does not provide constructive feedback or guidance, but instead focuses on belittling them at every opportunity. When Hermione Granger, the brightest student in the class, makes a mistake, Snape humiliates her, calling her a know-it-all and displaying his disdain for her intellect. The effect of this on Hermione, who already feels the weight of being an outsider in the male-dominated wizarding world, is devastating. The idea of making mistakes in Snape's class is terrifying, as it leads to public shame and the fear of being humiliated in front of one's peers. This destructive environment contrasts sharply with what we see in the films, where Snape's interactions with students are largely reduced to terse reprimands and sarcastic comments that, while still harsh, do not carry the same weight of emotional damage. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Snape's treatment of Harry becomes even more pronounced. Harry, already struggling with the weight of his fame and his personal identity, finds Snape's cruelty to be especially damaging. In the book, Snape's treatment of Harry is not merely out of dislike, but is a personal vendetta based on Harry as resemblance to his father James Potter, with whom Snape had a bitter rivalry. Snape's personal animosity towards Harry is something that the films only hint at, but in the books it is a central element of their relationship. Snape goes beyond mocking Harry's skills and character. He actively tries to undermine his confidence, feeding into Harry's insecurities and deepening his sense of isolation. This constant verbal abuse in the classroom is not an isolated incident. Throughout the series, Snape's treatment of other students, particularly those from Gryffindor and Hufflepuff, is consistently demeaning. In Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, for example, Snape is quick to criticize Neville Longbottom in front of the entire class, calling him a dunderhead and showing little patience or understanding for the student's struggles. For Neville, who already suffers from a lack of confidence, this public criticism is yet another blow to his self-esteem. Snape's behavior is a stark reminder of how damaging a teacher's words can be, but the film adaptation brushes over the emotional devastation that his remarks cause, focusing instead on his more theatrical interactions with Harry and other key characters. One of the key elements missing from the films is a deeper examination of the lasting effects of Snape's teaching methods. While the films present him as a character who is merely stern and cold, they do not show how his actions reverberate through the lives of his students. In the books, students like Neville and Hermione are deeply affected by Snape's cruel remarks and unjust treatment. Neville, for example, frequently doubts his own abilities, even when he demonstrates significant potential in other areas because of Snape's continued mockery. Hermione, despite her brilliance, struggles with the idea that she will never be good enough for Snape, a teacher who should have nurtured her talent, not crushed it. These emotional scars are not explored in the films, which instead present Snape as a figure who, though harsh, is ultimately revealed to be a tragic hero. The films, in their desire to make Snape's eventual redemption arc more impactful, gloss over the damaging effects of his earlier behavior. They present his relationship with Harry as one of antagonism, but with hints of a deeper, more complex motivation beneath the surface. This approach ignores the reality that Snape's treatment of Harry, along with his broader pedagogical failings, had real consequences for the emotional well-being of the students under his care. Snape's actions were not just part of a larger, grand narrative of redemption, they were a clear failure in his role as a teacher and mentor. By focusing on his eventual sacrifice and bravery, the films attempt to excuse his past behavior, reducing the true consequences of his actions to a mere footnote in the larger story. The lack of focus on Snape's pedagogical failures also undermines the complexity of his character. While his eventual reveal as a double agent and his personal struggles are certainly significant, they do not negate the years of harm he caused as a teacher. In the books, Snape's interactions with his students are not just personal failings, they are part of a larger system of power and control that he wields over his classroom. The emotional abuse that he doles out is not just a product of his personal history with Harry's father, but also a reflection of his inability to understand the responsibility he has as an educator. By focusing more on his internal conflict and less on the external damage he causes, the films fail to give a complete picture of Snape's character. Even when the films attempt to show Snape's softer side, they do so in a way that oversimplifies his character. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, for example, Snape's actions as a member of the Order of the Phoenix and his ultimate betrayal of Dumbledore are presented as part of a greater strategy to protect Harry. However, the film does not delve into how these actions are deeply intertwined with his failures as a teacher. Snape's harsh treatment of students does not suddenly vanish because of his loyalty to Dumbledore, nor does it become excused by his final sacrifice. The books make it clear that Snape's teaching style was a constant source of suffering for his students, regardless of the other elements of his character that may redeem him later. This lack of deep analysis of Snape's teaching failures in the films also reflects a larger trend in the adaptation of the Harry Potter series. The films, while visually stunning and emotionally engaging, often prioritize character development and action over the deeper, more nuanced aspects of the source material. Snape's role as a teacher is reduced to a few dramatic moments, and his relationship with his students is often simplified for the sake of storytelling. In the books, however, Snape's classroom is a microcosm of the larger themes of power, control, and authority that are present throughout the series. By failing to address these themes fully, the films miss an opportunity to explore the complexity of Snape, his character, in greater detail. In the end, the film's portrayal of Severus Snape, his role as a teacher, is incomplete and ultimately sanitizes his failings. While his redemption arc is one of the most poignant aspects of the series, it should not overshadow the reality of the harm he caused as a teacher. In the books, Snape's actions in the classroom are a stark reminder of the importance of empathy, understanding, and patience in teaching. The films, by ignoring the true extent of his pedagogical failures, dilute the message that being a teacher is not just about imparting knowledge, but also about caring for the emotional well-being of students. Number 23, erased line of betrayal toward Dumbledore. In the world of Harry Potter, Severus Snape is one of the most enigmatic and complex characters. His transformation from a seemingly pure villain to a deeply tragic hero is a key element in both J.K. Rowling's books and the film adaptations. However, the way his character is portrayed on screen differs significantly from the portrayal in the books, particularly regarding his relationship with Harry Potter and the secret he carries about Dumbledore's plan. In the films, Snape is depicted as a conflicted but morally upright figure, his actions clouded by personal pain and loyalty. In contrast, the book's version of Snape is far more ambiguous, with his actions driven by self-interest and a willingness to deceive even those he cares about for the greater good. One particular scene, when Snape discovers that Harry must die, is a prime example of how the films try to soften his character, turning him into a victim of circumstances rather than an active participant in a larger scheme. When Snape learns of the prophecy and its implications for Harry's fate, his reaction in the films is portrayed as a burst of raw emotion. He exclaims that they've raised Harry, I quote, 64, and appears genuinely shocked by the revelation. This moment is designed to evoke sympathy for Snape. The filmmakers want the audience to see him as a man caught in the cruel grip of fate, someone who cares deeply for Harry, even though he was once his enemy. This scene is framed as one of moral outrage, showing Snape as the one person in the room who stands up against the unjust killing of Harry Potter. It's a moment of moral clarity, as stark contrast to the otherwise morally grey world in which the story unfolds. However, in the books, Snape's reaction is much more calculated. He does not discover the truth of Harry's sacrifice at that moment. In fact, he has known about it for a long time. In the Deathly Hallows, it's revealed that Snape was fully aware of Dumbledore's plan to sacrifice Harry for the greater good. He was part of it all along. Snape did not have the emotional outburst that the films present. His apparent shock and anger are not genuine, but a carefully orchestrated act to maintain his cover as a loyal follower of Voldemort, even as he works against him. In fact, Snape's true feelings are far more complex. He agreed to Dumbledore's plan from the start, knowing that Harry had to die, but also understanding that it was part of a greater strategy to ultimately defeat Voldemort. His performance in front of the other characters is meant to reinforce his role as a double agent. The difference in how this moment is presented in the books versus the films is significant. In the books, Snape's feelings are ambiguous. He is not portrayed as a simple hero or villain, but as a man constantly grappling with his past, his loyalty to Dumbledore, and his deep love for Lily Potter, which compels him to protect Harry, even at great personal cost. His knowledge of the prophecy and its consequences does not shake him to the core as it does in the film. Instead, Snape views his role as one of necessity and sacrifice, an understanding that is not based on a desire for personal redemption, but on a cold, strategic decision to protect the wizarding world. In the film, however, Snape protests about Harry's death is framed as an emotional plea designed to make the audience believe that he is, in fact, the one person who truly cares about Harry. The filmmakers are attempting to cast Snape as a tragic figure, a man who, despite all his flaws and his association with dark forces, is ultimately driven by a deep, moral sense of right and wrong. This cinematic portrayal presents Snape as a victim, someone who is constantly battling with the guilt of his past actions and the decisions he has to make for the greater good. The films want the viewer to believe that Snape is an anti-hero, that his seemingly cruel actions are only part of a much larger self-sacrificial plan. The portrayal of Snape's character in the films strips away the more morally ambiguous aspects of his nature. In the books, he is not a knight in shining armor or a tragic figure caught in a web of fate. He is a man who is willing to make terrible sacrifices for the greater good, but those sacrifices come with a heavy personal cost. His loyalty to Dumbledore is not born out of blind faith or altruism, but from a complex mixture of guilt, love, and the need for redemption. Snape's knowledge of Harry His role in the defeat of Voldemort, his willingness to keep this secret, and his continued manipulation of the people around him, including Harry himself, are all elements of his character that are downplayed or entirely omitted in the films. This makes his ultimate death and the revelation of his true loyalty all the more shocking and emotionally charged for audiences who have been led to believe that Snape protested Harry. His sacrifice was a moment of personal moral clarity. The cinematic version of Snape is softened in other ways as well. In the films, Snape's relationship with Harry is presented as one of reluctant, sometimes hostile, mentorship, but it's clear that he cares for the boy in his own way. In contrast, the book portrays Snape's feelings for Harry as far more complicated. Snape's hatred for Harry, inherited from his rivalry with Harry's father James, is apparent from the very first book. But it's also evident that Snape's feelings are coloured by his own past traumas and the pain of losing Lily Potter. Snape's role as Harry's protector is not one of pure benevolence. It's rooted in a deep sense of duty to her memory. He does not save Harry because he sees him as a surrogate son, but because he made a vow to protect him, and because Harry is key to the defeat of Voldemort. In the film, Snape's actions are presented as a series of redemptive moments that slowly reveal his true loyalty. Each act of protection and each instance of sacrifice builds to a grand reveal that frames Snape as the ultimate hero. But this framing in the films erases much of the complexity of Snape as character. The true depth of his pain, his moral ambiguity, and his manipulations are glossed over to create a character arc that is both more understandable and more comforting for the audience. The emotional core of the film is about Snape's redemption, about his willingness to sacrifice everything for the greater good. But this is a simplified version of the character, one that does not fully capture the nuanced, morally grey decisions that define him in the books. By the time Snape's true role is revealed in the Deathly Hallows, the audience is meant to feel both sorrow and admiration for him, but the films fail to capture the true depth of Snape's tragedy, which is his willingness to sacrifice his own happiness, morality, and ultimately his life for a cause that he is never fully convinced will succeed. The films want to depict him as a reluctant hero, but in doing so, they strip away the darker aspects of his character. They paint him as someone who can be redeemed, someone who ultimately chooses the right side. But in the books, Snape's choice is far more complicated, and his redemption, though hard-won, is not a simple matter of right and wrong. The contrast between the books and the films in terms of Snape's portrayal highlights the difference between storytelling in literature and film. While the books delve into the emotional and moral complexity of Snape's decisions, the films opt for a more straightforward narrative of redemption. Snape's character in the films is softened, made more palatable to an audience that seeks closure and a definitive moral resolution. The truth, however, is far murkier. Snape is not simply a tragic hero or a villain, but a man whose actions were driven by a deeply personal sense of duty, loyalty, and love. His redemption is not a triumph of good over evil, but a recognition of the moral complexities that define his character and the sacrifices he was willing to make for the greater good. Number 24. Omitted humiliations of other teachers. Severus Snape, one of the most complex characters in the Harry Potter series, is an embodiment of contradictions, cruel and kind, bitter and self-sacrificial. However, the films, while showcasing his enigmatic qualities, did not fully explore or depict the extent of his harshness, particularly toward his colleagues. In the books, Snape is not just a disciplinarian who punishes students, but a toxic presence within the staff room, one who actively undermines and humiliates his fellow teachers. This side of Snape, full of condescension and sharp sarcasm, was largely omitted in the films, which instead painted him as a distant but noble figure, removing much of the tension and conflict he stirred within Hogwarts. The first noticeable discrepancy between Snape in the books and the films comes in the form of his interactions with Professor Trelawney. In Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, the films show Snape as merely dismissive of her predictions, and, while cold and aloof, he does not exhibit the disdain that is so clearly evident in the book. In J.K. Rowling's portrayal, Snape's behavior toward Trelawney is outright cruel. He mocks her profession, belittles her in front of her students, and most importantly, he plays a role in her humiliation in the staff room. When Professor Trelawney is dismissed as divination professor in the Order of the Phoenix, Snape's role in her dismissal is not given the attention it deserves. He plays a part in the gossip and backbiting that leads to her losing her job. The film portrayal removes Snape's complicity in this, instead presenting him as a mere bystander. This airbrushing of his cruelty toward Trelawney is a critical part of the film's attempt to cleanse Snape's character. The films also sanitize Snape's interactions with Hagrid. In the Chamber of Secrets, there is a significant moment when Snape mocks Hagrid's brief tenure as a teacher and openly dismisses his knowledge of magical creatures. In the books, Snape constantly undermines Hagrid, dismissing his abilities as a teacher and belittling his efforts in front of others. Snape's sarcasm is not just confined to students, but extends to colleagues as well. He frequently mocks Hagrid as failures, something the films subtly downplay. While the films show a vague antagonism between Snape and Hagrid, they do not delve deeply into the cruelty Snape displays, particularly when it comes to Hagrid's attempts to teach magical creatures. In the books, Snape's dismissive comments are calculated, meant to chip away at Hagrid's self-confidence and diminish him as a colleague. The films missed this toxic dynamic entirely, presenting Snape as aloof but ultimately more of a stern, morally ambiguous figure than a hostile, undermining one. One of the most striking differences in the films is the portrayal of Snape, Ash's attitude toward Nymphadora Tonks. In The Half-Blood Prince, Snape's behavior toward her is harsh, with him openly mocking her for the change in her Patronus, a subtle but cruel comment on her unrequited love for Remus Lupin. This personal insult, which shows Snape's lack of empathy and his propensity to humiliate others, is downplayed in the films. In the book, Snape's reaction to Tonks is downright mean-spirited, showcasing his tendency to use people's vulnerabilities against them. This is not a side of Snape that is captured in the films, where his character is largely neutral and devoid of the cutting remarks that define his interactions in the books. The change in her Patronus becomes a source of emotional pain for Tonks, something Snape seems to take pleasure in, but the films reduce this to a minor interaction. This loss of complexity is a major oversight in the adaptation, as it removes the starkness of Snape's toxic nature and his ability to weaponize personal struggles for his own amusement. Snape's disdain for those he deems inferior, especially the less academically capable staff members, is a theme in the books that the films gloss over. His disdain for Hagrid and Trelawney is not only about their teaching abilities, but also about their status as members of a less respectable academic community. Hagrid, who is of humble origins, is a target for Snape's elitism, while Trelawney is constantly mocked for her eccentricity and her position in a subject often dismissed as nonsense. Snape, ever the elitist, sees himself as superior to these two characters, and this superiority is expressed in a toxic, undermining manner. In the Order of the Phoenix, Snape sneers at Hagrid's lack of proper wizarding education, and in The Half-Blood Prince, he openly criticizes Trelawney, his position as a fortune-teller. These interactions are laced with condescension, but in the films they are either toned down or entirely removed, leaving Snape's animosity toward his colleagues more ambiguous. The films also overlook the full extent of Snape's aggression toward the staff during the staff meetings. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, the books present Snape as a member of a team that is often openly hostile toward each other. He openly disagrees with Professor McGonagall, dismisses Hagrid's suggestions, and undermines Trelawney, Cadiss's teaching methods. These moments highlight the toxic dynamics at play within the staff room, but the films reduce these moments of open hostility to brief, largely unremarkable exchanges. The tension between Snape and his colleagues is largely absent, leaving viewers with a less complex, more neutral version of Snape. This is in stark contrast to the books, where Snape's contempt for his colleagues is palpable and contributes to the toxic environment at Hogwarts. In the books, Snape is not only a negative presence among students, but also in the staff room. He contributes to the division and the infighting, creating a toxic work environment for everyone involved. He doesn't merely isolate himself from the other teachers, he actively undermines them at every turn, belittling their knowledge, their expertise, and their personal lives. This behavior is what makes Snape such a toxic presence at Hogwarts. His cruelty extends beyond students, and it is this aspect of his character that gives him a truly repellent aura, making his eventual redemption arc that much more impactful. The films, however, remove much of this toxic nature, leaving Snape's character more refined and less morally ambiguous than he is in the books. By doing so, they not only simplify his character, but also rob the audience of the full complexity that makes Snape one of the most compelling figures in the series. So the films do include moments of Snape as harshness towards students, such as his interactions with Harry, Hermione, and Ron, but these scenes are never as emotionally charged or complex as the ones involving his colleagues. The cruelty he displays toward his fellow teachers is integral to understanding Snape's character, as it shows how his bitterness and resentment permeate every aspect of his life, not just his relationship with students. In the book, Snape's bitterness is tied to his feelings of inadequacy, his longing for recognition, and his need to exert control over those he deems inferior. This need to belittle and humiliate others is a key component of his toxic behavior, but in the films, this aspect of his character is downplayed to create a more noble and less abrasive figure. Snape's toxic attitude also extends to his role in the Order of the Phoenix. While he is reluctantly part of the group, his disdain for some of its members is evident in his behavior. He does not hesitate to belittle others within the Order, and his condescending nature toward characters like Tonks and even Lupin shows his continued belief in his own superiority. In the films, these aspects are largely ignored, and Snape's role in the Order is presented as more self-sacrificial than self-serving. This revision of Snape's character further diminishes the complexity of his role, reducing him to a figure of ultimate moral ambiguity rather than a deeply flawed, sometimes toxic individual who learns to reconcile his darker tendencies. The absence of Snape's toxic interactions with his colleagues in the films is a missed opportunity to explore his complexity further. In the books, Snape is not simply a teacher who bullies students. He is also a deeply flawed human being who actively creates tension and division among the staff. His cruelty toward Trelawney, Hagrid, and Tonks highlights the depth of his insecurities and his need to assert control over those he sees as weaker. By removing these interactions from the films, the filmmakers stripped Snape of much of the moral complexity that makes him such a fascinating and tragic character. His ultimate redemption in the books feels earned precisely because of the harsh, toxic elements of his personality that are revealed over time. Without this, Snape's character arc in the films feels less compelling and less impactful, as much of what makes him truly memorable is lost in translation. Number 25. Silence about his disdain for muggles. Severus Snape's character in the Harry Potter films is undoubtedly one of the most complex and intriguing figures in the entire saga. However, the cinematic adaptation has significantly altered the portrayal of his character, particularly when it comes to his deep-seated prejudices toward muggles. In J.K. Rowling's books, Snape's views on muggles and muggleborns are made explicit, shedding light on his early ideological leanings and the reasons for his association with Voldemort and his Death Eaters. The films, however, take a markedly different approach, largely omitting this aspect of his character and, in doing so, attempt to present Snape as someone who merely, it's called quote 73, rather than a person who consciously embraced a discriminatory ideology. This subtle but powerful omission shifts the moral weight of his character and gives the audience a different perspective on his ultimate redemption. In the books, Snape's early attraction to Voldemort's ideology is revealed in several key moments. From the very beginning of his association with the Dark Lord, Snape's views are shaped by a sense of superiority over muggles, which becomes an integral part of his character. His fascination with the term mudblood is not a casual one, but reflects a deeply ingrained belief in the superiority of pureblood wizards. The term, a venomous slur in the wizarding world, is first introduced when Snape, in his youth, uses it to insult Lily Potter, Harry's mother. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, it is revealed that Lily, deeply hurt by Snape's use of the word, noticed how his views were aligning more with those of Voldemort. She sees the shift in him and distances herself, a decision that shapes much of Snape's personal pain and anger. Snape's rejection of Lily's friendship, and later his bitterness toward her choice to marry James Potter, is not merely a product of jealousy. It is deeply entwined with his adherence to the Death Eater philosophy, which holds Muggleborns in disdain. Lily's refusal to accept his ideology, his bitterness over her love for James, and his self-hatred all stem from the dissonance between his inner beliefs and the rejection he faced from the very people he wanted to belong to. Snape's obsession with blood purity and disdain for muggles can be traced back to the beliefs that drew him to Voldemort in the first place, but these are not explored in depth in the films. The films, by contrast, focus primarily on Snape's suffering and the loyalty he shows to Dumbledore and Harry, sidelining the darker aspects of his character. In the cinematic version, Snape's contempt for muggles is never explicitly acknowledged. We do not hear him make derogatory comments about muggle-borns, nor do we see any overt signs of his early allegiance to the Death Eater's ideology. Instead, the films portray him as a man who made a mistake in his youth, a mistake that led him down a dark path from which he eventually seeks redemption. This narrative, although compelling, diminishes the complexity of Snape's journey and obscures his true nature as a person who once consciously chose to embrace a system of prejudice and hatred. A notable example of this distortion can be found in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. In the book, Harry learns of Snape's past through the Pensieve, where he witnesses Snape's teenage years and his involvement with the Death Eaters. Here, Snape is not merely a misguided soul, but someone who was actively involved in Voldemort's hate-filled agenda. He uses the word mudblood without hesitation, reflecting his deep-seated belief in the superiority of purebloods. The films, however, cut out much of this context, reducing Snape's earlier views to the occasional glimpse of his troubled past, but without addressing the ideological motivations that led him down the dark path in the first place. One of the most crucial omissions in the films is the way Snape's disdain for muggles and muggleborns is left unspoken. In the books, Snape's use of slurs like mudblood is not just a random insult, it is a symbol of the deep-rooted belief in the inherent inferiority of muggles. This belief is what initially drew Snape to Voldemort's side and is central to his character arc. Yet in the films, this aspect of his personality is not emphasized. Instead, Snape is presented as a tragic figure, someone who made a wrong turn in his youth but ultimately found a path to redemption. This creates a more sympathetic image of Snape, but at the cost of a critical part of his character development. The omission of Snape's early prejudices also impacts the portrayal of his relationship with Harry Potter. In the books, Snape, or hatred for Harry, is not just based on personal animosity or his rivalry with James Potter. It is also a product of his deep-seated belief in the superiority of pure blood wizards and his disdain for Harry's Muggle heritage. Snape's actions throughout the series, his treatment of Harry, his constant mocking of Harry's insecurities and his general cruelty are all tied to this underlying belief in blood purity. The films, however, depict Snape's treatment of Harry as more of a personal vendetta, focusing on his hatred for James Potter and his anger at being forced into a position of loyalty to Dumbledore. This simplifies the motivations behind Snape's behavior, reducing them to a personal grudge rather than a reflection of his broader, more dangerous worldview. This transformation in Snape's character arc is most noticeable during the climactic revelation of his true loyalties in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. In the books, Snape's ultimate act of redemption is not simply an emotional choice to protect Harry, but a consequence of the deep guilt he feels over his past actions and the choices he made in his youth. The knowledge that Lily's death was indirectly caused by his own involvement in Voldemort's plans weighs heavily on him. This remorse is tied to the realization that his belief in Voldemort's ideology was wrong, not just morally, but in the sense that it led to the destruction of the one person he truly loved. The films, however, portray Snape's redemption as more of a moment of personal grief and sacrifice, largely ignoring the ideological roots of his actions. The films emphasize his loyalty to Dumbledore and his unrequited love for Lily, yet they fail to explore how his past beliefs shaped the person he became. By downplaying the importance of Snape's early beliefs, the films provide a more streamlined, sympathetic version of his character, but they also miss an opportunity to present a fuller, more morally complex portrayal of his journey. The character of Snape in the books is a deeply flawed individual who grapples with the consequences of his own prejudices. He is not simply a victim of circumstance, but someone who consciously chose to align himself with a system of hatred and oppression. The films, however, reduce him to a tragic figure who made a mistake, and in doing so, they obscure the full extent of his moral and ideological transformation.